The story of 4-year-old Gus Lamont has unsettled South Australia in a way few cases ever have. It is not only the fact that a child disappeared from a remote Outback station, nor the scale of the search that followed. It is the unnerving question that continues to echo across the country. How does a child vanish in full daylight with no footprints, no discarded item, and no confirmed trace, even after one of the largest search operations in South Australian history? It is a question that sits at the centre of this investigation. It pushes beyond the emotional weight of the case and into something broader, something structural. What happens when a well-established search system encounters an environment that can erase evidence faster than humans can find it? This video examines the idea of system failure without pointing to individual blame, a concept widely studied in emergency management, search theory, and environmental science. It does not accuse any person or agency. Instead, it looks at how an entire system can be overwhelmed when the environment itself becomes the strongest opposing force. To understand why Gus's disappearance remains such a mystery, we first need to revisit the earliest hours of the search. The first 72 hours are always the most critical in a missing child case, especially in Australia's interior. These hours shape the trajectory of everything that follows: who responds, what areas are prioritised, how modelling is built, and how the environment influences every decision on the ground. On the late afternoon Gus vanished, the conditions on Oak Park Station were typical of the South Australian outback. Dry air, open plains, soft topsoil in some areas, firmer ground in others, and shifting winds capable of disrupting surface markings within minutes. At around 5 p.m, Gus was last seen near a small rise of sandy ground, only a short distance from the homestead. By 5:30 p.m, when he could not be located, family members began searching the immediate area, expanding outwards to several hundred meters. When the initial search yielded nothing, local support was called in, and by 8 p.m, SAPOL had been notified and activated a nighttime response. Across the next 3 days, dozens of personnel grew into hundreds. SES volunteers, police officers, trackers, aerial crews, and later defence assets began sweeping large portions of land surrounding the property. Aircraft scanned wide sections of terrain, drones were deployed, and ground teams walked extensive grids across sand, clay pans, spinifex patches, and low scrub. Thermal imaging, forward-looking infrared, and mapping software helped plan where resources should go next. Despite these efforts, the search produced no confirmed evidence linked to the child. A single partial footprint was examined, but later deemed inconclusive. No clothing, no disturbed vegetation, no clear direction of travel. The absence of physical signs became one of the most confronting aspects of the case. To the public, this looked like failure, but specialists in search and rescue operations saw something more complex. A scenario where the system was not flawed, but the environment was far more powerful than the system's tools. Australia's outback is one of the most deceptive landscapes on Earth. It can appear flat, yet hide countless gullies, sink lines, and pockets of scrub dense enough to block aerial visibility. The soil can be soft enough to hold a footprint for hours, or firm enough to show nothing at all. Winds can move topsoil into shallow ripples that erase smaller depressions quickly. Light at dusk and dawn distorts shadows, obscuring details that would otherwise be obvious. Vegetation can create visual noise from above, making thermal detection unreliable when the ground radiates heat long after sunset. These environmental realities do not absolve the tragedy. They explain the complexity. They also illustrate how even the best-equipped search teams face severe limitations when confronted with a landscape that does not assist them. This introduction aims to frame the question at the heart of our investigation. Did the search system fail, or did the landscape override what the system was designed to do? When people hear system failure, the mind often jumps to human error, mismanagement, or overlooked clues. Yet in emergency science, the term refers to something broader, a system reaching the edge of its capability due to factors outside its control. In this case, those factors include environmental physics, heat dispersion, soil composition, wind patterns, topographical blind spots, and the unpredictable movement patterns of a small child. Understanding this nuance is crucial, not only for fairness, but for accuracy. SAPOL, SES, and supporting agencies followed established protocols for a missing child in extreme terrain. They expanded their search radius, revisited zones, brought in advanced technology, and consulted external experts. The absence of results does not automatically signify a procedural mistake. Instead, it highlights the immense power of natural forces in a region where distance, heat, and silence can overpower even the most coordinated response. For many Australians, this case taps into a deeper cultural awareness. The Outback is iconic, vast, beautiful, and unforgiving. It is a place where nature dictates the rules. Stories of people losing their bearings, or of evidence being swallowed overnight by shifting ground, have been part of our collective memory for generations. Yet this is perhaps one of the first times the entire nation is seeing those forces collide directly with modern technology and coordinated search strategy, and watching technology fail to produce answers. As we move through this investigation, we will not reach for sensational explanations. There is no need to exaggerate what is already deeply unsettling. Instead, we will examine why the search system, despite its scale and sophistication, struggled from the start. We will outline how environmental science, child movement modeling, aerial search limitations, and soil behavior contribute to the mystery. And we will explore how nothing found is not always an indicator of human oversight, but sometimes the natural consequence of a landscape that can erase evidence faster than investigators can uncover it. Nothing in this introduction suggests a conclusion. It simply establishes the conditions that make the central question so difficult and so compelling. How does a child vanish in a place where hundreds of trained professionals were searching almost immediately with all available tools and still find nothing? This is not a question about blame. It is a question about capability, environment, and the limits of human search systems when confronted with the scale of the Australian outback. When a child goes missing in remote South Australia, there is a well-practiced system that comes into play. In the case of 4-year-old Gus Lamont, that system was activated quickly and at scale. South Australia Police, State Emergency Service volunteers, Australian Defence Force personnel, local property owners, and specialist air crews all converged on the Outback station near Yunta. On paper, it looked like the best possible response. In practice, it still could not produce the one thing that mattered most, a trace of the missing boy. From the first night, SAPOL coordinated the search operation. General duties officers attended initially, followed by detectives and senior command, as the seriousness of the situation became clear. Their role was twofold: to manage the search on the ground and to build a clear investigative picture of what had happened in the hours before Gus vanished. While investigators spoke to family members and documented the timeline, uniformed officers worked alongside SES volunteers to begin the first structured ground sweep around the homestead. The South Australian State Emergency Service brought in trained searchers accustomed to working in rough terrain. These volunteers walked line searches, checked fence lines, dams, creeks, and depressions, and followed up on any sign that might suggest movement: broken twigs, disturbed soil, loose rocks, or clothing. They were equipped with radios, maps, and GPS devices, helping command to track coverage in real time. As it became obvious that the situation was not resolving quickly, additional resources were deployed. Aerial assets were brought in, helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft capable of scanning large areas of land relatively quickly. Some were equipped with advanced cameras and thermal imaging systems designed to detect heat signatures during the evening and early morning periods. Drones were also used to examine areas that were difficult or dangerous for ground crews to reach, such as steep rises, uneven gullies, and patches of dense scrub. The Australian Defence Force contributed capability through personnel and aircraft support, adding extra eyes and equipment to an already substantial effort. Together, SAPOL, SES, and ADF formed a layered search system, combining ground observation, aerial surveillance, and mapping-based planning. At the center of this effort was the Standard Search Grid, a structured grid imposed over the landscape to ensure that no area within the designated radius was left unchecked. Search managers divided the terrain into sectors, each assigned to specific teams. Grid-based searching is the global norm for missing person operations because it reduces overlap, gaps, and confusion. It allows command to mark off completed sectors and plan follow-up passes when necessary. In theory, this approach should have maximized the chances of finding a small child moving on foot. In reality, several factors made the grid far less reliable than it might be in a suburban or forested environment. The first challenge lay in how the initial grid radius was set. Search planning always begins with assumptions. How far a person of a certain age, size, and condition could realistically travel within a set period. For a 4-year-old, planners might use established models based on previous cases: average walking speed, likely rest periods, tendency to walk in non-linear paths, and attraction to or avoidance of certain features like roads, water, or structures. These models are useful, but they are not perfect. A small error in estimating time or distance at the outset can have major consequences in a landscape where a few minutes of unobserved movement can equate to hundreds or thousands of meters. If the starting assumption about direction is slightly off, if the child veers left instead of right, or follows a shallow wash instead of crossing it, the bulk of the grid may focus on the wrong vector. In densely populated or clearly bounded terrain, this can be corrected quickly. In the Outback, where the land stretches in all directions with few natural limits, a misjudgment at the beginning can mean that a child moves beyond the actively searched radius before the error is recognized. The second challenge relates directly to Outback geography. Standard grids assume that terrain is relatively consistent within each cell. In reality, cells in this environment can contain a mix of surfaces: soft sand, hard pan clay, low scrub, rock outcrops, small depressions, and shallow channels. A searcher might have clear visibility across one half of the cell, but only partial visibility across the other half, especially if light is low or the ground is uneven. From above, vegetation can hide subtle changes in elevation, where a child might rest, shelter, or collapse. A grid that looks strong on a map can be full of blind spots on the ground. The third challenge involves human limits. Even well-trained searchers get tired, especially under Outback conditions. High daytime temperatures, glare, dry air, and long distances take a toll. Fatigue reduces the ability to pick up fine details, like a small footprint or a faint disturbance in the soil. When a child's footsteps are already shallow and quickly degraded by wind, the chances of spotting them drop even further as hours pass. A grid can be technically complete, but practically imperfect, because humans cannot maintain peak observational sharpness for endless shifts in punishing conditions. Aerial searches face their own constraints. Helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft are powerful tools, but they cannot fly at extremely low altitudes over long periods due to safety, turbulence, and terrain hazards. From higher altitudes, the detail visible on the ground is limited. Small items, like a child's shoe or a scrap of fabric, often blend into the landscape. Thermal imaging systems, while impressive, are affected by the heat radiating from the ground. In the late afternoon and evening, Outback soil releases stored heat, making it difficult to distinguish a small heat source from the background. This thermal clutter is well documented in search and rescue literature and significantly reduces the usefulness of infrared technology in hot, open environments. Drones with cameras can provide closer, more controlled coverage, but they too have limitations. Battery life restricts flight time. Wind gusts affect stability. Dust and heat can interfere with performance. Operators must prioritize specific zones rather than scan endlessly, and those decisions are based on the same initial modeling that may already contain small errors. All of this meant that, despite the presence of SAPOL, SES, ADF, helicopters, drones, and ground teams, the system was working against a landscape that quietly undermined it at every turn. Each pass of the grid increased confidence statistically, but could never guarantee complete certainty. From a distance, the public saw headlines about massive search operations and extensive ground and air searches, and understandably assumed that if nothing was found, there must have been some fundamental failure. A closer look suggests something less dramatic, but no less confronting. A system functioning largely as designed, yet still unable to overcome the environmental forces at play. The reason this is so difficult to accept emotionally is simple. When we hear that hundreds of people have searched thousands of hectares using modern technology, we expect results. We expect something to show up. A footprint, a dropped item, a piece of clothing. When nothing appears, it feels unnatural, almost impossible. But in Outback conditions, it is not impossible. It is rare, deeply unsettling, but scientifically and practically feasible. In that sense, the failure is not one of effort or intent. It is a failure of reach. The system, even at full capacity, could not fully match the scale and hostility of the environment surrounding Oak Park Station. The standard search grid, usually a powerful tool, was weakened by the Outback's variability. Human observation was weakened by heat and distance. Technology was weakened by the very ground it was trying to interpret. This section is not about criticizing SAPOL, SES, or ADF. It is about recognizing that they deployed what they had, in the way current doctrine suggests, and still hit the limits of what any system can achieve in this kind of terrain. Their work forms the backbone of the story, but it also sets up the deeper question we will explore next: whether the assumptions built into the grid itself and into our understanding of this landscape might need to change. In every missing child investigation, experienced search coordinators will repeat one principle. The first half hour matters more than any piece of equipment. Before the helicopters, the drones, the thermal cameras, and the mapping software, there is a very simple question that shapes everything that follows. At what exact time was the child last definitely seen, and at what exact time was it first noticed that they were gone? In the case of 4-year-old Gus Lamont, that window is broadly understood. He was last seen around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, near a low rise of sandy ground not far from the homestead. By roughly 5:30, when he did not appear in response to calls, family members raised the alarm and began searching. On paper, it looks straightforward, a 30-minute gap. But in the world of search planning, 30 minutes is not a neat block of time. It is a container for uncertainty, memory, stress, and environmental change. International search and rescue practitioners have spent decades analyzing how early timing errors can ripple through an operation. Their findings show that even small misjudgments in the initial timeline can have outsized consequences, particularly in open environments like the Australian Outback. When a child is missing, adults rarely note exact times in the moment. They are focused on supervision, tasks, routine movement, and general awareness, not on watching the clock. It is only once the child is missing that time suddenly becomes critical, and by then, the precise minute-by-minute record often no longer exists. This is not a matter of negligence. It is how human memory works under normal conditions. People round times up or down. They use anchors like just after 5, before it got dark, or around the time we were doing the afternoon jobs. Under stress, this tendency increases. When police later ask for specifics, family members do their best to reconstruct the sequence, but their estimates may differ by a few minutes. International experts note that this is a global pattern in missing child cases. It is not unique to South Australia, nor to this family. For a 4-year-old, those few minutes can mean a great deal. A child of that age does not move like an adult, but they can cover surprising distances when walking continuously, especially if they are curious or following something that interests them. A commonly used rule of thumb suggests that a small child might walk anywhere from 1 to 3 kilometers in an hour, depending on terrain, fatigue, and motivation. Some recorded cases show greater distances in specific circumstances. If the child is moving continuously and not aware they are lost, they may walk further than an adult expects. Search planners use these models to estimate a maximum possible radius of movement from the last known point. The challenge is that the radius is directly tied to the timeline. If Gus was last seen at 5 and the search did not effectively begin until 5:30, planners may initially assume a potential movement window of 30 minutes. However, if the true last confirmed sighting was a few minutes earlier, or if the child began moving away while still technically in sight but not being watched closely, the effective movement window could be longer. That extra 5 or 10 minutes does not sound like much in everyday life.
In search modeling, it can translate into hundreds of additional meters in any direction. In the Outback, where there are few natural stopping points, this matters even more. Unlike urban areas, where fences, roads, and buildings provide boundaries that slow or redirect movement, the land around a remote station often allows unbroken walking in multiple directions. A child who happens to follow the line of a shallow drainage channel or a faint stock track may be guided further than one who hesitates in the open. If the initial search grid is built on an optimistic estimate of how far they could have traveled, the outer sections of that grid may already be behind the child's actual position. Experts in search theory talk about initial miscalculation, not as a failure of individuals, but as an inherent risk when dealing with incomplete information. They identify several common sources. One is the understandable tendency to assume the child has stayed close, especially when previous behavior supports that belief. If a 4-year-old usually remains within a certain radius, adults may anchor their expectations to that pattern. Another is the natural shock when a child cannot be seen where they were moments earlier. The period spent calling out, checking obvious spots, and assuming they will reappear may feel shorter than it was. Only when those attempts fail does the situation become a search in people's minds. For investigators, reconstructing this period requires gentle, detailed questioning. They ask, what was happening immediately before Gus was last seen? Who else was nearby? What tasks were being done? Was anyone watching him continuously? Did anyone see him change direction or move away from his usual play area? Answers to these questions help narrow down the true start of the movement window, but they are never perfect. Memory is influenced by stress, hindsight, and the desire to make sense of events that now carry enormous emotional weight. The difference between 5 o'clock and 5 past, or between 20 past and half past, might seem minor. But in a landscape where a child could cover 1 to 2 kilometers in half an hour, perhaps more if they are moving steadily downhill or along an easy surface, that small difference reshapes the assumptions about where the child might be when the first organized searches arrive. When search coordinators draw their initial circle on the map, they are really drawing a band of probability, not a hard limit. Inside that band, they concentrate resources. Outside it, they may send only a few teams, at least at first. If the true radius of movement is larger than assumed, the child may already be near or beyond the outer edge of the highest density search area by the time teams begin detailed sweeps. In dense bush, this might still allow for eventual detection as the grid expands. In the Outback, with huge distances and relatively sparse coverage further from the homestead, there is a greater risk that the child crosses into areas that will not be checked for many hours, if at all. Another complication is that 4-year-olds do not necessarily walk in straight lines. International literature on lost child behavior highlights that young children often walk in arcs, circles, or zigzags. They may follow features such as shadows, animal tracks, or the line of the horizon. They may walk towards or away from sounds. This means that simply drawing a neat radius around the last known point may underrepresent the true path length. A child could walk what would amount to 3 kilometers of total distance while still ending up only 1 or 2 kilometers away in a straight line. If planners use straight line distance alone, the search grid might underestimate the time the child has been on their feet. When we combine all these factors, rounded time estimates, emotional shock, non-linear movement, and a landscape without boundaries, the concept that a 5-minute timing error equals several kilometers of possible distance becomes less abstract. It reflects a real amplification effect built into the physics of movement and the psychology of recall. In the context of the Gus Lamont case, this does not mean anyone made a specific mistake. It means that the system was operating under the same constraints that affect every similar investigation. The earliest data point, the actual minute when Gus began moving away from the last place he was seen, cannot be known with absolute certainty. Everything that follows, including the placement of search grids, is therefore an approximation. This section is not about criticizing the family or suggesting their recollections were inaccurate. It is about acknowledging, in a calm and factual way, that no family in this situation can provide a perfectly timed record of events. Nor can any search team eliminate all uncertainty once the first half hour has passed. The Outback magnifies that uncertainty because there are fewer natural checks on how far a child might go, and fewer witnesses to intersect their path. What emerges from this analysis is a sobering reality. Even when everyone acts quickly and in good faith, the first 30 minutes can contain enough unknowns to shape the entire outcome of the search. In a place where the horizon is open and the distances are unforgiving, the line between within reach and beyond the grid may be no more than a few uncounted minutes. When people first hear that helicopters, drones, and thermal cameras were used extensively in the search for 4-year-old Gus Lamont, the instinctive reaction is to assume that such technology should have provided clarity. It feels almost intuitive to believe that modern tools, operating across an open outback landscape, ought to locate a small child or at least uncover some sign of movement, a footprint, a piece of clothing, or a disturbance in the soil. But the reality faced by search teams on Oak Park Station was far more complex, shaped by natural forces that quietly undermined the reliability of each device. Technology did not fail because it was inadequate. It failed because it was deployed in an environment capable of neutralizing its strengths. Drones were among the first tools deployed. Lightweight, maneuverable, and capable of covering difficult terrain, they have become indispensable in Australian search efforts. Yet the Outback places severe constraints on what drones can actually detect. As temperatures climb, the soil absorbs heat, storing it across the afternoon and releasing it through the evening. This rising warmth sends small but persistent currents of hot air upwards. Drone operators call this thermal turbulence. It does not bring a drone down, but it shakes the image enough that small details blur or ripple. A faint footprint, a light indentation, or a scattering of disturbed soil loses its definition. Dust, lifted by wind sweeping across the flats, creates another layer of interference, softening edges and altering color tones. Even a drone positioned at an ideal height will return footage that looks clear at a distance but loses precision where it matters most, at ground level where a child's presence would leave its weakest traces. Thermal imaging, often regarded by the public as a near-perfect tool, is affected even more severely. In cooler climates, the difference between body heat and ambient temperature is stark, allowing cameras to outline a human figure with relative ease. But the South Australian outback holds on to heat long after the sun begins to drop. The ground emits a constant wash of residual warmth, creating a background that competes directly with the small heat signature of a child. Instead of a clean contrast, the thermal camera produces an image filled with competing hotspots: warm rocks, heated patches of soil, reflective surfaces, and even clusters of vegetation. The phenomenon is known among specialists as thermal washout. It means that a small body can disappear entirely into the broader heat landscape. The technology is not flawed, it is simply overwhelmed by the conditions.
In such temperatures, the surface of the land becomes almost indistinguishable from the living body the camera is trying to detect. Helicopters, another expected advantage in remote searches, faced restrictions of their own. These aircraft cannot fly at extremely low altitudes over outback terrain for extended periods. Heat rising from the ground creates unstable air pockets that make low-level flight risky. Winds shift abruptly, and dust can lift in sudden sheets that obscure both forward and downward visibility. Vegetation and subtle changes in the land's surface, barely noticeable from the homestead, introduce hazards that pilots must respect. As a result, helicopters operate higher than many people imagine. The combined effect of soil, heat, and wind also works against even the most trained ground searchers. Detecting footprints is not as simple as looking for depressions in the sand. Footprints from a 4-year-old are shallow and inconsistent, and the outback's mixed soil structure produces uneven impressions.
In one step, the child may leave a clear mark in loose sand, but the next few steps may fall on firmer clay or gravel, leaving no imprint at all. Wind can erase footprints within minutes. Light shifts quickly in the evening, flattening shadows that might otherwise reveal the subtle rise and fall of disturbed earth. As fatigue sets in among searchers, walking kilometer after kilometer beneath harsh glare, the human eye becomes less capable of distinguishing natural imperfections from meaningful signs. Even in ideal conditions, footprint detection is delicate and fallible. In the outback, it becomes a near impossible task. These individual limitations form a broader pattern. Drone coverage is restricted by heat and dust. Thermal cameras. The public often imagines these technologies as infallible, as though their presence should guarantee discovery. But search specialists know that technology is inherently contextual. It performs well in environments suited to its strengths. It struggles when those strengths are countered by nature. In the case of the search for Gus Lamont, technology allowed teams to cover vast areas, to rule out certain regions, and to support ground operations with essential mapping data. What technology could not do was extract a child-sized trace from a landscape actively working to erase it. The outback is not passive in these searches. It moves, radiates, reshapes, and blurs. It becomes an active participant and, at times, an adversary. To understand why the search for 4-year-old Gus Lamont produced no clear trail, it is necessary to look beyond the technology and focus instead on the landscape itself. The South Australian outback is not simply a backdrop to the investigation. It is a dynamic environment shaped by heat, wind, dust, and vegetation, each acting upon the ground in ways that quietly dismantle the physical signs a small child might leave behind. In a place like Oak Park Station, the terrain becomes an active agent, capable of wiping footprints, dispersing scent trails, masking ground disturbance, and creating visual illusions that mislead even experienced trackers. For investigators and volunteers, the challenge was not a lack of effort or tools. It was the overwhelming nature of the land. The soil in this region is a shifting blend of sand, clay, and fine gravel. Unlike compacted earth, which preserves footprints cleanly, the mixed soil of the outback forms impressions inconsistently. A child weighing only a few kilograms produces shallow marks that barely register unless the ground is loose at the exact point of impact. One step may leave a faint shape, while the next step disappears entirely. This variability makes it difficult to establish any kind of linear trail. The ground holds imprint depth for only minutes before wind or heat alters the surface. What remains after that is little more than a textured pattern that looks identical to undisturbed soil. Wind is perhaps the most destructive element. Even on what locals describe as a calm day, the outback generates low, persistent breezes that brush across the surface and lift thin layers of dust. When the wind picks up, which it does regularly in late afternoon, the soil behaves like fluid. Fine particles slide over the top layer of the ground, filling depressions and softening edges. A child's footprint can lose definition in as little as 15 minutes. In stronger conditions, the print disappears altogether,
replaced by a uniform coating of wind-swept dust. Search teams often return to areas they walked earlier only to find the ground transformed, as if no one had ever passed through. The Outback does not leave clues intact. It moves constantly, and those movements erase the delicate signatures of a small body's presence. Heat plays a subtler but equally significant role. During the day, the sun strikes the ground with intensity, warming the soil to the point where the upper layer becomes malleable. When the temperature drops suddenly at dusk, the soil contracts, shifting slightly and altering the shape of footprints. The edges that once appeared sharp become soft and indistinct. In some cases, a footprint seems to vanish entirely as the soil resettles into its natural structure. The process is invisible when observed casually, but for investigators relying on consistent impressions, it complicates tracking dramatically. Heat refraction also affects visibility. Waves rising from the ground distort what searchers see a short distance ahead, creating mirages or blurring subtle variations in the soil. What might be a shallow footprint seen in the morning becomes impossible to detect as the temperature rises. The period around dusk introduces another major obstacle.
As light begins to drop, shadows lengthen in ways that obscure small details on the ground. Tracks that were visible under full sunlight become muted. The Outback's color palette shifts into deep reds and browns, flattening contours that would otherwise signal disturbance. The human eye relies on contrast to detect irregularities, and twilight removes that contrast almost completely. Search teams walking during this time must slow their pace, but even then, the chances of spotting a faint child's footprint fall dramatically. This effect persists until well after sunset, and by the time artificial light is used, the opportunity to read the natural ground surface has already passed. Vegetation also contributes to the disappearance of physical traces. Mulga scrub and spinifex grass dominate large patches of the terrain. Mulga grows in clusters with low, fine branches that scatter leaf litter across the ground. These tiny fragments fall in layers, drifting into any indentation made by a passing foot. A small step taken by a child can be covered within an hour as dry leaf material shifts with wind or movement from wildlife. Spinifex creates similar challenges. Its stiff blades form protective domes that shield the ground beneath from direct sunlight and wind, creating microclimates. If a child steps among these clusters, the grass springs back quickly, hiding the disturbance. Searchers often describe these areas as visually impenetrable. Nothing looks out of place because the vegetation naturally forms irregular patterns that conceal subtle signs of movement. The combination of soil, wind, heat, and vegetation creates blind spots across the landscape. These are areas where the natural environment prevents any reliable reading of ground disturbance. Blind spots can extend for meters or even whole sections of terrain. A child passing through such a space might leave no footprint, no broken vegetation, and no traceable path. For investigators, this means that even the most systematic search is vulnerable to gaps. A team may walk within meters of a significant point, but remain unaware of it, simply because the terrain has masked the evidence. In the context of the search for Gus Lamont, these blind spots became critical. They explain why a systematic grid search, even when performed precisely, might not detect every possible sign. Animal activity adds another layer. Kangaroos, emus, and smaller mammals move through the region constantly, and their tracks overlay human footprints. A child's shallow marks are quickly overridden by deeper impressions left by animals. When searchers arrive hours later, the ground shows signs of movement, but not necessarily the movement they are seeking. The mix of tracks creates confusion rather than clarity. In some instances, animal trails can look like partial human footprints, diverting attention toward misleading paths. Search experts are trained to identify these differences, but in fading light and under pressure, mistakes can happen. The Outback's vastness amplifies all of these effects. Oak Park Station covers an enormous area, and the search zone extended well beyond the initial radius as hours passed. For each additional kilometer searched, the number of microenvironments increases.
sandy patches, clay pockets, spinifex clusters, and mulga corridors. Each behaves differently under stress from weather and movement. This diversity means that even if search teams identify one type of footprint in one location, they cannot assume that the next few meters will preserve similar evidence. Consistency is nearly impossible to achieve on such terrain. To the public, the idea of losing a child's trail may seem improbable. But those who work in remote search operations understand that the Outback operates under its own rules. It does not hold traces unless conditions are perfect. And even then, those traces are temporary. A footprint can survive 60 minutes under mild conditions, but in many cases, it lasts far less. When wind shifts, when soil warms or cools, when leaf litter drifts, the mark is erased. For a child as light as Gus, the ground is especially unforgiving. His footprints would be among the first to vanish. This does not diminish the work of searchers. Instead, it highlights the limitations imposed by nature. The absence of footprints does not indicate a lack of movement. It indicates that the terrain has acted upon the evidence in predictable but unavoidable ways. For investigators, understanding these dynamics is crucial. Without recognizing how the land deletes signs of passage, it becomes easy to misinterpret the lack of ground evidence as a sign that the child did not travel far. In reality, the land simply refused to preserve his steps. Taken together, these environmental forces shaped the search at Oak Park Station from the beginning. They restricted what could be found, how long evidence remained visible, and where the team could reasonably expect to locate ground-based clues. The Outback is vast, but more importantly, it is active. And in the hours after Gus disappeared, it did what it has done for millions of years. It moved, shifted, and settled, leaving behind no clear record of what passed across it. When examining why the search for 4-year-old Gus Lamont yielded no clear signs of movement, one factor repeatedly raised by specialists is the presence of blind spots. These are pockets of land where the environment prevents effective ground reading, aerial visibility, or technological detection. Blind spots exist in every search, regardless of the resources deployed. But in the South Australian Outback, they become considerably larger and more complex. Understanding these spaces is essential to understanding how a child could pass through an area that has been searched multiple times without leaving any identifiable trace. The first type of blind spot involves small rock crevices scattered across the terrain. At Oak Park Station, many of these are shallow, narrow openings formed by the natural cracking of the ground during extreme heat cycles. They are often partly concealed under loose soil or covered by fine vegetation, making them almost invisible to the naked eye. A small child may step into one without recognizing the risk, using it as temporary shade or simply passing through without awareness. Once inside these crevices, visual detection from above becomes nearly impossible. Searchers walking nearby may overlook them because they blend seamlessly with the surrounding soil. A crevice only 10 or 20 centimeters deep can distort footprints around its edge, further complicating the reading of ground disturbance. These areas are not large, but they create interruptions in any potential trail, preventing a continuous line of movement from being reconstructed. Shallow gullies formed by seasonal water runoff present another significant challenge. They are common across outback landscapes and typically stretch for long distances while remaining only a few meters wide. Because the ground inside a gully is often harder or covered in leaf litter, footprints do not register well. The uneven slopes also cause loose material to slide downward, covering any marks that might have been left earlier. From an aerial perspective, gullies appear as shadows or dark lines, but their internal surfaces remain hidden. If a child moves down one of these channels, their direction can change without leaving visible cues for the search team. Even with drones and helicopters monitoring the area, the narrow shape of these formations creates natural corridors that remain difficult to inspect thoroughly. Dense vegetation pockets also create extensive blind spots. Mulga stands and thick spinifex fields, which are common in this region, limit visibility at ground level to only a few meters. The structure of mulga branches produces overlapping layers of shade that distort color and texture on the soil, making small footprints nearly indistinguishable. In spinifex fields, the stiff grass blades form protective domes that hide the ground underneath from both wind and sunlight. Anyone searching must physically part the vegetation to inspect the soil, slowing progress dramatically. In situations where time is critical, search teams cannot manually probe every square meter of dense scrub. These vegetated blind spots can cover large portions of the landscape, creating zones where a small child could move, rest, or hide without being detected by foot teams or aircraft. Another limitation involves areas that aircraft simply cannot reach effectively. Helicopters require a safe clearance zone to operate, and in the outback, uneven ground, unpredictable wind shear, and dense vegetation restrict low-altitude flights. Pilots often cannot descend below a certain height without risking safety. When forced to fly higher, the ability to detect subtle ground disturbances drops significantly. Drone operations face similar restrictions. Thermal imaging systems lose accuracy when angled above dense scrub or rocky terrain, where heat signatures reflect unpredictably. These aerial blind spots do not imply oversight. They reflect inherent constraints placed on aviation by the landscape itself. Even highly trained pilots and advanced drone operators cannot overcome conditions where the terrain restricts visibility. Modeling assumptions also create their own blind spots. At the beginning of any search, teams rely on movement predictions based on age, terrain, health, and behavioral factors. These models determine search grids and resource distribution. However, if the assumptions are even slightly off, large areas may be deprioritized. For a child as young as Gus, small behavioral deviations, such as choosing shade over open ground or walking toward a familiar object, can place them outside the initially anticipated radius. Behavioral science acknowledges that young children do not always follow predictable patterns. They may walk in curves, spiral loops, or zigzags, covering more distance than modeling suggests. Once search teams anchor their grid to a particular assumption, areas outside that predicted movement zone receive fewer resources, effectively becoming operational blind spots. Environmental noise further compounds the issue. In the outback, wind is constant and often loud enough to mask human calls. A child taking shelter in a shallow depression behind vegetation or near a rocky outcrop may not hear searchers calling their name. Conversely, searchers may not hear faint responses from the child. These acoustic blind spots mean that even when searchers are physically close, communication through sound remains unreliable. This factor is often underestimated, but plays a significant role in the early hours of a search, when a child might still be conscious, mobile, or attempting to respond. Heat haze, dust, and shifting light patterns during different times of the day create visual blind spots that cannot be eliminated by human vigilance. Experienced trackers often describe the outback as an environment where the ground changes itself, altering textures and patterns hour by hour. As the sun moves, shadows create illusions. A shallow print may appear deep, while genuinely disturbed ground looks normal. Searchers must read the land repeatedly under different lighting conditions to confirm what they see. But in large-scale operations, time limits prevent multiple passes across every square meter. As a result, areas inspected under less favorable conditions may inadvertently be classified as clear, even though evidence could be present beneath the surface layer. Finally, wildlife movement creates dynamic blind spots that shift throughout the day. Kangaroos, goats, emus, and feral animals move unpredictably across the landscape, disturbing soil and vegetation. Their tracks overlay potential human footprints, creating ambiguity. Places visited by animals shortly after the child passed through may appear completely unaltered to search teams. These natural disruptions contribute to a constantly shifting canvas where definitive interpretation becomes difficult. Taken together, these blind spots form a network of uncertainty that surrounds every large-scale search. They do not indicate failure of effort or strategy. They highlight the inherent limits imposed by nature. In the case of the search for Gus Lamont, these blind spots emphasize a critical reality. Even a rigorous, well-resourced operation cannot fully overcome the complexity of the outback. The land itself defines what can and cannot be seen. When examining why the search for 4-year-old Gus Lamont failed to reveal even a single reliable sign of movement, one theory consistently appears in discussions among search specialists: the possibility that the initial modeling of how a young child moves through outback terrain was incorrect. This theory does not blame search teams or question their efforts. Instead, it highlights the reality that modeling human behavior, especially children's behavior, under stress is far from precise. In the Australian outback, a small misreading of movement pattern can redirect the entire operation. The first limitation relates to the assumption that a child follows a roughly straight or predictable path.
In many search protocols, modeling begins with a calculation of how far a person might travel within a given time frame, then expands outward from that central point. For adults, this can be reasonable. For children, however, studies repeatedly show that they seldom walk in straight lines. Their natural movement curves, loops, and diverts, often without an obvious external trigger. A child may turn to investigate something, then turn back, then change direction again after only a few steps. In wide, open landscapes such as the region surrounding Oak Park Station, these subtle changes accumulate into highly irregular travel paths. A distance that appears small on paper can become far greater when movement is non-linear. One behavioral framework commonly referenced by specialists is the wander and hide pattern. This model explains how young children often behave when separated from familiar adults. In the initial phase, children tend to walk, sometimes briskly, sometimes slowly, without a specific destination. This wandering may continue for several minutes or longer, depending on the child's personality. After a period of walking, children commonly transition into the hiding phase, especially if they become frightened, tired, or overwhelmed by environmental noise. They may crouch behind vegetation, enter shallow depressions, or remain still for long periods. This hiding behavior significantly reduces their visibility. It also makes aerial detection more difficult, because thermal signatures from a small body beneath shade or vegetation blend with the ambient heat of the ground. The outback adds another layer of complexity. Environmental sounds, particularly wind moving through mulga and spinifex, can be loud and disorienting. For a young child, this noise may feel threatening rather than comforting. Research into child psychology shows that children under stress often retreat from sound, not toward it. This has direct implications for search operations. If a child interprets the noise of approaching vehicles, aircraft, or multiple adult voices as danger rather than help, they may move away from the search effort rather than toward it. This behavior is not uncommon. Many search and rescue case studies across Australia reference children who avoided or did not respond to calls, even when searchers were close by. Case studies from the Northern Territory provide useful insight. In one incident involving a missing child aged 5, search teams initially focused within a 2-kilometer radius. The child was later found significantly further out, at the end of a curved track created by repeated changes in direction. Although the total walking time was less than 2 hours, the curved route translated into nearly double the distance that linear modeling predicted. The child had also rested beneath a low bush for several hours, avoiding both noise and sunlight. When the child was eventually found, searchers noted that the child remained silent even when approached, a reminder that behavioral patterns do not always align with adult expectations. Queensland has recorded similar outcomes. In one case, a 3-year-old child disappeared from a rural property near dense scrubland. Search teams modeled movement based on an expected travel radius, only to later discover that the child had followed a zigzag pattern toward a distant watercourse. The child's path made little logical sense when mapped, yet it reflected spontaneous curiosity and a desire to remain near familiar sites such as trees or open ground.
vegetation concealed the child from drones, and thermal imaging failed due to heat rising from the earth in the early afternoon. The child survived, but the search radius had to be doubled twice before detection. Western Australia provides additional examples. In one case, a child moved along the contour of a low ridge, staying just below the crest where aerial teams could not detect movement. The child's winding path down the slope, shaped by wandering behavior and intermittent hiding, placed them well outside the initial grid. Modeling later showed that a deviation of only 10 or 15 degrees at the start led the child into an entirely different sector. The delay this caused added almost a full day before teams adjusted their search boundaries. These cases highlight a consistent theme. Children often do not behave according to predictable movement formulas. Their paths are influenced by immediate sensory experiences: light, heat, sound, fear, curiosity, rather than long-term intent. In the Outback, where the terrain can change appearance quickly under shifting light and wind, even a small child may move in ways that appear counterintuitive to adults. In the context of the search for Gus Lamont, this theory suggests that early modeling might have relied on movement expectations that did not fully account for the complexity of a 4-year-old's behavior. If the initial predicted radius was even slightly underestimated, or if the assumed direction was misinterpreted, the official grid could have been positioned just off the true path. Once the large-scale operation was underway, resources were naturally concentrated within the expected zones. Areas outside these zones, while not ignored, received less continuous attention. Behavioral specialists further note that children often choose shaded routes rather than open ground. This means they may follow tree lines, scrub edges, or shallow creek beds. From above, these areas are the most difficult to assess. They hold deep shadows and uneven textures that disrupt drone and helicopter observation. If a child moves along these shaded corridors, even briefly, it becomes exponentially harder for search teams to detect them. Human reasoning also influences search design. When no evidence is found in the early hours, teams naturally rely more heavily on modeling. But if the initial assumptions were off, subsequent adjustments may still revolve around an inaccurate anchor point. This creates a compounding effect, where each planning decision further reinforces the modeling's influence, even if the underlying assumptions were flawed. It is also worth noting that search teams operate under time pressure. With daylight fading, heat rising, and safety concerns increasing, practical limitations often force difficult decisions about where to allocate resources. In such conditions, modeling provides necessary structure, but structure does not guarantee accuracy, particularly in environments where movement patterns are highly variable. The theory that the search failed because of a misreading of child movement patterns is not a criticism of those involved. Instead, it reflects an understanding that human behavior is inherently unpredictable, and that modeling remains a tool, not a certainty. The Outback amplifies every deviation, turning small behavioral differences into major logistical challenges. In the case of Gus Lamont, this theory keeps open a wide range of possibilities. If the child walked in curved lines, sought shade, avoided noise, or followed the edges of vegetation, he may have traveled far beyond the assumed radius. If those areas received less focus because they fell outside the primary modeling zones, evidence may have been missed simply because the land was too vast and the behavior too unpredictable to map with precision. This theory does not answer the central question of what happened to Gus, but it does explain how a child could move through a landscape saturated with search resources without leaving a clear trail. The answer lies not in failure, but in the intersection between human unpredictability and the Outback's overwhelming scale. One of the most confronting aspects of the search for 4-year-old Gus Lamont is the complete absence of physical evidence. There are no confirmed footprints, no items of clothing, no disturbed vegetation, and no reliable markings on the ground. For many observers, this absence becomes a point of confusion. How can a child move through an environment as open as the South Australian Outback without leaving any trace? The answer lies in the nature of the landscape itself and the speed at which outback conditions erase even the most fragile signs of human presence. Outback soil is not a uniform surface. Around Oak Park Station, the ground is a mix of loose sand, fine dust, and lightly packed clay. This creates a texture that shifts easily under pressure but does not always hold shape for long. A small footprint, particularly one made by a child who weighs little, may register only a shallow impression. That impression can collapse within minutes if exposed to the region's characteristic winds. During the time Gus disappeared, wind conditions were variable but strong enough to disturb the top layer of dust. Even a soft breeze can redistribute sand, smoothing the surface until the original indentation becomes impossible to distinguish from natural patterns. The outback's heat plays another major role. As the sun lowers toward the horizon, the ground releases stored heat in uneven patterns. These rising thermal currents can distort both visual and thermal imaging. They can also loosen the soil structure, causing already shallow footprints to crumble or blend into surrounding textures.
In the late afternoon, precisely when Gus was last seen, the combination of falling light and rising heat creates visual dead zones that significantly reduce the chance of spotting tracks. Light conditions during the critical search window further complicate detection. At dusk, shadows stretch across the landscape in irregular bands. These shadows conceal subtle marks, making it difficult for both ground teams and aerial observers to detect changes in texture. A footprint that might be visible at midday becomes indistinguishable under the diffuse light of evening. This is one reason search specialists emphasize the importance of immediate response. Once dusk arrives, the percentage of recoverable evidence drops dramatically. Vegetation also contributes to the disappearance of signs. The mulga and spinifex common in the region form thick clusters that trap dust and debris.
If a child steps between these plants, the surrounding vegetation may spring back into place, erasing any visible disturbance. The soil beneath mulga branches is often protected from direct wind, meaning it may remain soft and loose. A single step can sink slightly into the dust, but the imprint fills in quickly once the surface settles. From above, the area appears untouched. This interaction between wind, soil, and vegetation explains why no footprint does not automatically mean no child passed through here. The landscape resets itself quickly. Tracks become unreliable indicators, and assumptions based solely on visible impressions can be misleading. Search and rescue professionals across Australia regularly warn that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially in arid regions. Real-world examples reinforce this point. In the Northern Territory, a missing child was once believed to have remained near a homestead because search teams found no footprints leading outward. Days later, the child was located kilometers away. Investigators later learned that the child had walked over hard, sun-hardened ground that left almost no imprint. Subsequent gusts of wind eliminated the few shallow marks that may have been left. The lack of tracks had falsely suggested the area was undisturbed. In Western Australia, a similar case involved a boy who walked along a shallow drainage line. The soft soil beneath the surface crust allowed his feet to sink, but the upper layer of dust and dry vegetation quickly blew back over the impressions. When search teams passed through only hours later, the ground appeared untouched. The child's eventual rescue confirmed he had travelled through that same area, despite the absence of visible evidence. Queensland has documented incidents where thermal imaging failed to identify recently disturbed ground. Heat rising from the soil masked the slight temperature changes caused by a child's footsteps. When experts reviewed the footage later, they noted that the equipment had performed within its limits. The environment simply overwhelmed its capability. These examples highlight an important reality. Even advanced technology cannot reliably detect every sign of movement when temperatures and ground conditions are unfavorable. In South Australia, search teams are familiar with these limitations. They regularly caution the public against assuming that a clean landscape indicates a lack of activity. Footprints, broken twigs, disturbed sand, and other classic signs fade far more quickly in the outback than they do in forested or grassy environments. What might linger for days in other regions can vanish within an hour on exposed ground.
The implications for the Gus Lamont search are significant. If Gus moved during the first hour after being last seen, any tracks he created may have been erased by wind before search teams arrived. If he spent time near vegetation or within drainage channels, his movements may have left no detectable trace. If he moved during dusk or in low light, visual detection would have been severely compromised. Each of these factors on its own reduces the likelihood of finding physical evidence. Combined, they create a scenario in which a complete absence of signs is not only possible, but plausible. This understanding shifts the perspective on the search. Instead of interpreting the lack of evidence as a definitive statement, it becomes a reflection of the unforgiving environment. The outback does not preserve, it removes. Within this context, the question is no longer, why is there no evidence? But, how much evidence ever had a chance to survive? This distinction matters. It shapes how investigators interpret early assumptions, how search zones are expanded, and how the community understands the challenges faced by those involved. It also preserves the range of possibilities that remain open in the case. Without physical traces, conclusions cannot be drawn with certainty. The landscape itself prevents easy answers, leaving room for multiple scenarios, none of which can be ruled out solely because no evidence was found. In this sense, the absence of signs is not an explanation. It is a reminder of how the environment operates. It highlights the limits of human detection and the speed at which nature resets the terrain. And for a case as complex and emotionally charged as the disappearance of Gus Lamont, it reinforces the need for caution, patience, and an understanding of just how unforgiving the Australian outback can be. As the search for 4-year-old Gus Lamont continues to sit heavily in the minds of many Australians, one truth emerges more clearly with every expert briefing, every technical review, and every assessment of the terrain. The disappearance did not expose a failure of people, nor a failure of effort. Instead, it highlighted the overwhelming reality that the South Australian outback is a landscape capable of outmatching even the most determined and well-resourced search operation. In cases like this, the environment becomes the dominant variable, one that cannot be completely controlled, predicted, or overcome. Throughout the operation, search teams deployed systems that have been proven across countless missing person investigations. SAPOL, coordinated ground search crews, aviation assets, drones, and mapping specialists. SES volunteers walked extensive grids for hours at a time, often in harsh conditions. The Australian Defence Force contributed aircraft and technical support.
Private landholders offered equipment, knowledge, and access to remote sections of terrain. The system, in its procedural sense, functioned as it is designed to function, organized, methodical, and comprehensive within realistic boundaries. Yet, despite this effort, no confirmed trace of Gus has been found. To understand why, it is necessary to acknowledge the underlying factor that shaped every outcome. The outback itself, the ground, the air, the heat, the vegetation, and the scale, interfered with almost every technique available. It is not a reflection of inadequacy within the system, but a reminder that some environments possess characteristics humans simply cannot neutralize. When search specialists describe the outback, they often refer to it as a land that gives nothing back. It swallows sound, erases footprints, distorts visibility, and generates false impressions of distance and depth. The ground changes throughout the day as light shifts and heat rises. Disturbed sand can settle so quickly that even experienced trackers struggle to read it. Vegetation conceals tracks within minutes, and the sheer size of the landscape means that even a small misjudgment in early modeling can spread the search radius across vast distances. This is why SAPOL has consistently stressed a factual but measured position. All possibilities remain open. The lack of evidence does not confirm any single scenario. It does not confirm harm, nor does it rule out survival. It reflects the natural limitations imposed by the environment. It is easy to imagine search operations as a linear process: people sweeping ground, aircraft scanning overhead, technology identifying anomalies. But in the outback, none of these tools behave in predictable ways. A drone that performs flawlessly in urban terrain can lose accuracy when heat radiates from the soil. Thermal imaging that detects animals at night may miss a child sheltered under vegetation. A helicopter that covers a large area cannot safely fly low enough to see fine detail. Each tool works within limits, and the landscape pushes those limits to their edge. The initial 72 hours, while critical, were subject to these same constraints. Search teams moved quickly, but conditions on the ground changed just as quickly. Wind patterns shifted, shadows lengthened, surface soil loosened and settled. If footprints were ever present, they may have vanished long before the first systematic grid was established. As experts often note, the outback's capacity to erase signs is not gradual, it is immediate. Even the effort to refine the search using modeling demonstrates the tension between human capability and environmental dominance. Behavioral predictions are essential tools, yet young children often wander in patterns that diverge from expected models. They move erratically, curve instead of walk straight, and respond to sensory cues adults might ignore. When this unpredictable behavior interacts with a landscape that erases evidence, the result is a scattering of potential paths that extend well beyond initial expectations. The conclusion many Australian search experts reach is simple but sobering. When a small child disappears into the outback, the environment becomes the primary obstacle, not the systems deployed to respond. It works against ground searches, aerial teams, and technology in equal measure. This understanding helps contextualize why SAPOL refuses to close the case. Without evidence, a conclusion cannot be justified. The investigation remains active, with Task Force Horizon reviewing modeling, conducting additional assessments, and keeping all potential scenarios within consideration. This is not a sign of uncertainty. It is a recognition of the land's complexity. For the South Australian community, the ongoing absence of answers is challenging. People naturally search for clarity, wanting to understand how such an extensive operation could yield so little. Yet the explanation rests in the same reality the search teams confronted. The land is vast, layered, and unforgiving. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a practical, physical way that undermines even the most disciplined search strategies. This case has drawn significant public attention because it forces a difficult question. How much control can humans realistically exert over an environment so large and so changeable? The answer is not one that provides comfort, but it does provide perspective. The system did not fail. The people involved did not overlook their responsibilities. The outback simply operated in the way it has always operated, a landscape shaped by geology, weather, time, and silence. In the broader story of Australian missing person cases, the disappearance of Gus Lamont aligns with a familiar theme. The land itself plays a defining role. Family, communities, and investigators may move through it, but they cannot fully read or command it. This does not diminish their effort, it underscores the scale of the challenge. As the investigation continues, the focus remains factual and measured. SAPOL has made clear that until evidence guides them toward a definitive answer, the search for clarity must remain open. They continue to review new modeling, reassess earlier assumptions, and examine areas previously overlooked due to environmental constraints. Their approach reflects a principle deeply rooted in Australian policing: no closure without evidence. For those watching from across Australia, in closing, the most accurate and responsible conclusion is this: the people involved in the search acted with commitment, professionalism, and urgency. The tools they used were pushed to their limits. The systems functioned as intended. The gap that remains, the absence of evidence, is shaped not by human failure, but by the overpowering nature of the South Australian outback. It is a reminder that some landscapes cannot be conquered, only respected, even when the stakes are as high and as heartbreaking as they are in this case.